By the middle of the 1930s, 52nd Street had supplanted Harlem as the jazz capital of the world. Swing Street, a two-block stretch between 5th and 7th Avenues, contained all of the most important jazz clubs of the time. In the 1930s, a few of the clubs were willing to hire African-American performers, but most, fearing that white patrons weren't ready for black entertainment, maintained strictly segregated stages. Billie Holiday remembered that white musicians were singing from one end of 52nd Street to the other, but there wasn't a black face in sight on the street except pianist Teddy Wilson and me. Guy Lombardo, one of the white band leaders who helped popularize jazz on 52nd Street, recalled that for many years, nightclub owners simply refused to break the color line, fearing financial consequences. Lombardo had discovered Louis Prima in 1934 on a trip to New Orleans during Mardi Gras and arranged for the young trumpeter to meet with Eddie Davis, the owner of Leon and Eddie's, one of the most popular clubs on Swing Street. I felt I could talk him into hiring Prima, Lombardo remembered. But when the club owner saw Prima, he took Lombardo aside and whispered, "I can't use him." According to Lombardo, Eddie Davis, on first seeing olive-skinned and swarthy Louis Prima and knowing that he came from New Orleans, had simply assumed that he was a black man. The shame is not so much that he lost a gold mine, but that he capitulated to the prejudice of the times. Prima's penchant for hepcat talk and loose movements certainly didn't help. For 6 months, he recalled, I couldn't get a job no matter what Guy or anyone else tried to do for me. Finally, Prima was able to convince the new owner of the famous Door that he was white and was given a regular spot with his new band, his New Orleans Gang. Soon, tickets to the famous Door were the hottest in town, and Prima was the new swarthy face of New York jazz. Though his credentials were newly Caucasian, Prima's music was decidedly not. Billboard magazine reported that Prima's band played the music of a hot Negro orchestra made more compact. That may explain why people like it, because it is savagely rhythmic, almost primitive in its quality. According to his biographer, Gary Boulard, the savagely rhythmic man from New Orleans forever changed the way 52nd Street was viewed by jazz musicians. Before Prima, the street was a nice place to drink and listen to dance band music. After Prima, it was the only spot in town where hot, swinging jazz of a kind never heard before in New York City could only be found. According to the doorman at the famous Door, Prima drove female patrons to practically have an orgasm with the hoarse, horny voice of his. Moreover, word got out that he was rather well fortified, and there were lots of tables just bulging with females. Boulard attributes Prima's success to his exuberant blackness. When he danced and coiled his way across the bandstand, he presented to his New York audience a spectacle usually confined to the more suggestive black performances of Harlem. In fact, Prima's rather remarkable character traits were reminiscent of the more successful black entertainers of the day. Even his sartorial style violated the norms of respectable whiteness. Long before male entertainers broke away from the conventional dark business suit required for stage appearances, Prima was wearing lavender coats or yellow suits, or even red, white, and blue striped pants. Loud patterns, flashy colors, and the unconventional were the predominant themes in Louis's clothing. His clothes, voice, mannerisms, dancing, musical style, raw sexual appeal, and ability to sing scat as well as any musician in history prompted observers to compare Prima with various black performers. During his stand at the famous Door, Prima made the first recordings of his songs, including House Rent Party Day, in which Prima sings and speaks lyrics in the drum rhythms, and which was therefore, according to The Vibe History of Hip-Hop, the first recorded forerunner of rap. White jazz fans were not the only admirers of Prima's style. By the end of the 1930s, his band had played in black theaters in New York, Baltimore, and Boston, and was the only white band during the swing era that performed repeatedly at the Howard Theater in Washington, D.C., the largest colored theater in the world, and the Apollo Theater in Harlem. Sammy Davis Jr. made his first appearance at the Apollo with Prima's orchestra and remembered a certain racial confusion. Half the people who came to the theater thought Prima was black anyway. Mixed. So he was a big favorite. The host at the Apollo, Ralph Cooper, attributed Prima's success with black audiences to the fact that his style merged with the Apollo. Being from New Orleans and the Louis Armstrong, Joe Oliver background, I suppose that was one of the reasons his music appealed to us. From Nero to Blanco. Despite his popularity by the height of his career, Louis Prima was part of a dying breed. In 1906, an Italian government official named Luigi Villari came to Louisiana to investigate alleged mistreatment of Sicilian agricultural workers. He found that most plantation owners considered the Italian immigrant to be a white-skinned Negro and treated him accordingly. Villari regretfully concluded that the only way an Italian can emancipate himself from this inferior state is to abandon all sense of national pride and to identify completely with the Americans. Many Italian-American leaders learned de Villari's dictum and were also aware that several influential American thinkers doubted the inherent ability of Italians to become good Americans. They knew that a growing number of powerful Americans agreed with the assessment of Edward Ross, the president of the American Sociological Association, who wrote in 1914 of why Italians were among the least likely to assimilate. As grinding, rusty iron reveals the bright metal, so American competition brings to light the race stuff in poverty-crushed immigrants. But not all this stuff is of value in a democracy like ours. Only a people endowed with a steady attention, a slow-fused temper, and a persistent will can organize itself for success in the international rivalries to come. Wise to the rules of America, Italian-American leaders taught their people to be slow and steady. The assimilationist campaign gained desperate urgency in the early 1920s when Congress began curbing the immigration of undesirable groups. The 1921 Emergency Quota Act cut the flow of people from Italy and other southern European countries by roughly 75%. A year later, David Starr Jordan, the president of Stanford University, complained that the new law did not go far enough. Jordan called on Congress to completely bar immigration by Southern Italians, who were biologically incapable of rising, either now or through their descendants, above the mentality of a 12-year-old child. In 1923, in an article titled "Keep America White," the influential Current Opinion magazine called for tightening the quotas on immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. If the tall, big-boned, blue-eyed, old-fashioned white American is not to be bred out entirely by little dark peoples, Uncle Sam must not simply continue the temporary quota law in operation, but must make its provisions much more stringent. The following year, in one of its many articles calling for an end to Italian immigration, the Saturday Evening Post argued that because Southern Italians were part African, they were incapable of self-government and totally devoid of initiative and creative ability. The Post claimed that unrestricted immigration into southern Italy made a mongrel race of the South Italians, and that unrestricted immigration into the U.S. will inevitably and absolutely do the same thing to Americans. Amid the anti-Italian noise, the Order of the Sons of Italy in America sent a letter to Representative Albert Johnson, chairman of the House Committee on Immigration and a leading opponent of Italian immigration, arguing that Italians possessed a physical vigor and strong mentality, were sober, thrifty, and industrious, and constituted an unimpeachable racial factor in the formation of the American race of the future. Nonetheless, in 1924, Congress passed the National Origins Act, which further curbed immigration by Southern and Eastern Europeans and reduced the flow of Italians to 4,000 annually, a reduction of 98% from its peak at the beginning of the century. Italian-American representatives continued to argue that they were inherently American, as when Chicago's L'Italia newspaper declared in 1928 that the 200,000 Italians of Chicago represent an honest and laborious community. In the 1930s, when the Depression made competition over jobs and housing a life-and-death contest, many Italian-Americans began to heed the calls to distance themselves from bad Americans. Newspapers reported a number of incidents of Italians angrily protesting or violently confronting the influx of African Americans into their neighborhoods. But the efforts to distance themselves from blacks did not cohere into a new Italian-American racial identity and culture until the 1940s. As Thomas Guglielmo puts it, indeed, not until World War II did many Italians identify openly and mobilize politically as white. On the near North Side, where large populations of Italians and African Americans lived in close proximity, neighborhood hostility between Italians and African Americans was rare in the 1920s and 1930s. But in the 1940s, Italians waged several battles against black residents in their neighborhoods. Father Luigi Giambastiani of St. Philip Benizi Church, the largest Sicilian church in the city, led a movement to keep Italians and blacks segregated in new public housing projects. According to Guglielmo, prior to the 1940s, in his many public statements and essays in defense of Italians, Giambastiani mentioned whites rarely, defended Italians by highlighting their virtues as Italians, not whites. And even in his neighborhood battles against incoming African Americans in the mid-1930s, he shied away from explicit talk about whiteness. By the 1940s, however, Giambastiani's language had changed dramatically as Italians became whites and race became color. In a 1942 letter written on behalf of his constituency to the Chicago Housing Authority, Giambastiani explained that the cohabitation or quasi-cohabitation of Negro and white hurts the feelings and traditions of the white people of this community. Even more significantly, he declared a fundamental biological difference between his people and black people. You know, neither you nor I would cherish the idea of living next door to a neighbor from whom nature, tradition, and culture have segregated us. By this cohabitation, the Negroes might be uplifted, but the whites, by the very laws of environment, feel that they will be lowered. After years of speaking only for Italians and Sicilians, Giambastiani now represented the white people of St. Philip against the newly come Negroes. At the same time, a director of the Cabrini Public Housing Project reported being told repeatedly by Italian prospective residents that families would move in if the Negroes were segregated, but they would not if they are not segregated. A University of Chicago researcher found during the 1940s that attempts by blacks to move into the Italian neighborhood on the near West Side had been blocked by the persistence and resistance of the Italian community, and that the attempts of Negroes to use public facilities there still met with violence. In 1941, a group of young Italian men calling itself the Black Hand Gang began beating and shooting African Americans in the neighborhood, and 2 years later, a riot involving several hundred blacks and Italians erupted after shots were fired into an African American's apartment. In 1943, local Italians organized a petition drive to persuade city officials and a property owners association to buy all the available homes in the area to preempt blacks attempting to buy or rent them. During this time, arsonists set fire to several black homes, and Italian shop owners on the near West Side began refusing to serve African American customers. The rejection of blacks and the embrace of whiteness took on intellectual and political legitimacy during the war. Italian-American newspapers and newspapers published by labor unions with large Italian memberships reproduced the basic points in Ruth Benedict's best-selling 1943 book, The Races of Mankind, which included, as one newspaper put it, the point that the three primary races of the world are the Caucasoid, the Mongoloid, and the Negroid. The Aryans, the Jews, the Italians are not races. During the war, the Chicago city government regularly invited Italian Americans to participate in the annual I Am an American Day celebrations at Soldier Field, and the city's newspapers hailed Chicago's army of Italian folk who have been assimilated and Americanized to a large degree, and were going all out to win the war. In several major cities, the Order of the Sons of Italy in America launched drives to encourage Italian Americans to purchase war bonds, even though the funds for those bonds went partly toward defeating Italy. In the early 1940s, the U.S. naturalization application no longer required Italians to identify as a race separate from other whites. According to Guglielmo, in the first 5 decades of mass immigration, Italians were often listed as Southern or Northern Italian for race and white for color. By the beginning of World War II, however, Italians, as well as many other groups like Armenians, Yugoslavians, Greeks, English, Syrians, and Mexicans, began offering the same answer for the race and color questions: white. Perhaps the most powerful evidence of the success of the campaign to assimilate Italians into American culture was the fact that, unlike Japanese Americans, no Italian Americans born in the United States were interned as threats to national security during World War II, even though most Italian American newspapers had supported the rise of Benito Mussolini's fascist regime. Relations between blacks and Italians did not improve after the war. In 1947, several hundred students at Chicago's Wells High School, led by 3 Italian youths, walked out of classes to protest the district's allowing so many Negroes in our school. 1 month after the school strike, 10 African Americans died in a near West Side apartment building set ablaze by arsonists. And in 1951, in nearby Cicero, the National Guard was called in and martial law declared when arson and rioting greeted a black family who had moved into an all-white apartment building. Reports that most of the rioters were Italian Americans were affirmed by the Baltimore Afro-American, one of the leading national black newspapers, which identified them as 8,000 frenzied, bloodthirsty descendants of immigrants from the Mediterranean area of Europe. As Guglielmo concludes, whiteness was becoming, for the first time, a central part of Italians' public self-understanding. Like their Irish predecessors, Italian Americans seized on the most militant forms of public service as a means to assimilate. Italian American newspapers encouraged their male readers to enlist in the armed forces and trumpeted the sacrifice and valor of the sons of Italy in the service of Uncle Sam. During the 1940s, Italian Americans also began to move in large numbers into municipal police forces, in many cases supplanting Irish Americans as the dominant ethnic group in law enforcement. Frank Rizzo was one of many Italian Americans who used a law enforcement career to establish himself as both a good American and as an enemy of renegades. The son of immigrants, Rizzo joined the Philadelphia police force in 1943 and was assigned to the predominantly African American community of West Philadelphia. he rose through the ranks by raiding underground speakeasies and gambling parlors that were owned and patronized by blacks. In the 1960s, Rizzo, as Deputy Police Commissioner and then Chief of Police, ordered what he called "My Men, My Army" to arrest nearly every civil rights and black power activist who demonstrated in the city, including Malcolm X, members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and a group of black teenagers who held a rally for more courses on African American history in the city's public schools. In 1970, Rizzo was applauded by many of Philadelphia's Italian Americans when his officers raided the local headquarters of the Black Panther Party, hauled 6 members into the street, and forced them to strip naked in front of a news photographer. "Imagine the Black Panthers with their pants down," he said. Rizzo also cracked down on bad whites. He closed down beatnik coffeehouses and gay bars and banned hippies from the city. 1 year later, 86% of Philadelphia's Italian Americans voted for Rizzo in the mayoral election, helping to make him the first Italian American to hold the city's top office. As mayor, Rizzo opposed public housing in white neighborhoods, arguing that people there did not want black people moving in with them. The political scientists Jack Citron, Donald Philip Green, and David Sears have concluded that Rizzo transcended his Italian identity by becoming an established symbol of hostility to blacks. He also, as historian Stefano Lucconi puts it, helped Italian Americans replace their ethnic sense of affiliation based on national ancestry with a new racial identity as white. Niggas with short memories. During the rise of Italian Americans into American respectability, Louis Prima and the hepcats of his generation were replaced by men who did not dance. Like many Italians, and Irish before them, Frank Sinatra's parents moved from disrepute to citizenship through government work. In the 1910s and 1920s, Marty Sinatra worked as a prizefighter and bootlegger and operated a speakeasy with his wife, Dolly, who supplemented the family's income by performing illegal abortions. But Dolly worked her way up the ranks of the local Democratic Party, becoming leader of the 3rd Ward in Hoboken, New Jersey's 9th District, and, through her political connections, secured a job for Marty as one of Hoboken's first Italian-American firefighters. Though they passed on to their son a racial liberalism that was becoming increasingly rare among Italian Americans, Frank Sinatra's racial identification was white from the beginning. Whereas Louis Prima chose the black street musicians of New Orleans as his role models, Sinatra idolized the symbols of Caucasian performance of his day, the Protestant Anglo-Saxons, Bing Crosby, a descendant of Mayflower Pilgrims who grew up in Washington State, and Rudy Vallee, native of Maine and Yale graduate, whose first band was called the Connecticut Yankees. Crosby and Vallee popularized a new style of singing called crooning, which employed the tones of black jazz singers but replaced the bodily sexuality of jazz with a romantic and spiritual eroticism. Both were known for wearing conservative suits, standing stock still on stage, and for singing ballads instead of dance music. Vanity Fair magazine praised Vallee in 1929 for having none of the dash or rhythm of the usual jazz player, while scholars have characterized Crosby's style as a disembodied voice, and his personality as exuding the traditional values associated with white Protestant hegemony, a good work ethic, morality, family, and small-town living. When a teenaged Frank Sinatra saw Crosby perform in New Jersey, he decided to do that. The man who more than anyone reinvented the image of Italian Americans saw Bing Crosby as the father of my career, the idol of my youth. The only problem this caused for Sinatra was when Hollywood executives asked him to perform a few dance numbers in movies. "I had never danced," remembers Sinatra. "I didn't know how to dance." Along with Sinatra, an entire generation of tuxedo-clad, slow-moving Italian-American crooners followed Crosby to stardom. Ruggiero Eugenio di Rodolfo Colombo, Russ Colombo, Pierino Como, Perry Como, Francesco Paolo Lovicchio, Frankie Lane, Dino Crocetti, Dean Martin, Anthony Dominic Benedetto, Tony Bennett, Vito Rocco Farinola, Vic Damone, Gennaro Luigi Vitaliano, Jerry Vale, and Francis Avalon, Frankie Avalon, all credited Der Bingle of Spokane, Washington, as their primary influence. This new generation of Italian-American entertainers shared Sinatra's view of the new dance music that emerged in the 1950s. Rock and roll is the most brutal, ugly, desperate, vicious form of expression it has been my misfortune to hear, Sinatra told Congress in 1958. Rock and roll smells phony and false. It is sung, played, and written for the most part by cretinous goons, and by means of its almost imbecilic reiteration and sly, lewd, in plain fact dirty, lyrics. It manages to be the martial music of every sideburned delinquent on the face of the earth. In response to the raw, driving sexuality of black-influenced rock, young Italian-American men in New York and Philadelphia did to the new music what Sinatra and his generation had done to jazz. A style combining smooth vocal harmonies, romantic lyrics, and a stationary stage presence, doo-wop was invented in the 1940s by black youth on street corners, but it shot to the top of pop charts in the late 1950s when Italian-Americans adopted it as their own. Just as most African-American performers moved towards soul music. From 1958, when Dion, DiMucci, and the Belmonts placed several songs on the pop charts until the British invasion of 1964, Italian-American doo-wop groups dominated American popular music, all wearing conservative suits and exuding a benign romanticism. The Capris, the Elegants, the Mystics, the Duprees, the Del Satins, the 4Js, the Essentials, Randy and the Rainbows, and Vito and the Salutations declared the arrival of Italians into American civilization. During the rise of doo-wop and Frank Rizzo, Malcolm X mocked the newly white Italians. "No Italian will ever jump up in my face and start putting bad mouth on me," he said, "because I know his history. I tell him when you're talking about me, you're talking about your pappy, your father. He knows his history. He knows how he got that color." Though fewer and fewer Italian-Americans know the history of which Malcolm X spoke, some have reenacted it. As Louis Prima faded as the symbol of Italian America, he nonetheless remained devoted to its primitive past. In 1947, he scored one of his last hits, Civilization, Bongo, 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 a recording that might have served as the renegade immigrant's anthem. Singing I Don't Want to Leave the Congo and I'm So Happy in the Jungle, Prima mocks the members of Civilization who hurry like savages to get aboard an iron train and their work ethic. When they've got 2 weeks vacation, they hurry to vacation ground. They swim and they fish. Ha! That's what I do all year round. In the early 1950s, Prima joined with Sam Butara, another black Italian from New Orleans, and Butara's band The Witnesses, and began playing a harder, wilder version of his music. Music critic Art Fine wrote 30 years later, "The music they were playing, and that Prima sensed was vital and even visionary, then had no name. It's taken historians 30 years to pinpoint it for what it always was. Rock and roll." Prima further bucked the trend of Italian Americans toward civilization by proclaiming his admiration for the new jungle music. "There's nothing but nothing wrong with rock and roll," he said. "It's got that beat, and as long as the kids keep listening to it, they'll keep out of trouble. Don't sell those kids short. They've got an instinct for the kind of music that's fun to listen to and dance to." Prima chided his generation for attacking rock and roll and thereby renouncing its primitive past. "I don't know what their parents are complaining about," he said. "They used to dance the black bottom, and that was downright vulgar." In 1967, near the end of his career, Prima renewed his fame by performing a role in a film that was perfectly suited for him, as an orangutan. The character of King Louie in Disney's animated Oscar nominee, The Jungle Book, is the leader of the jungle apes and the host of a perpetual jazz party. In the film's most memorable scene, he sings, "I'm the king of the swingers, the jungle VIP," while dancing with what Prima's biographer calls hip abandon. Prima admired his character. "This cat really rocks the jungle," he said. In fact, the whole monkey tribe in the picture really swings, and they look a lot like me and Sam Butara, and the witnesses. In the 1970s, Italian Americans appeared for a time to have regained their rhythm. Disco was incubated in underground parties by Italian Americans in New York City, and according to music historian Peter Shapiro, Italian Americans, mostly from Brooklyn, largely created disco from scratch. Most of the DJs who developed the music in the early 1970s were of Italian extraction. Francis Grasso, David Mancuso, Nicky Ciano, Michael Capello, Steve D'Acquisto, Tom Savarese, Bobby DJ Gutadoro, Frankie Stravelli, and Richard Pompianelli. By the middle of the decade, disco dancing spread to nightclubs in Italian-American neighborhoods, from where it moved into mainstream American culture. The 1977 film, Saturday Night Fever, tells the story of the young Italian-Americans who ruled the dance floor at 2001 Odyssey on the Bay Bridge section of Brooklyn, the most famous early disco club in the city. In the first scene at the club, Tony Manero and his four buddies seem to be aware that they are living on a racial edge. One of them admires his hair and new clothes and asks, "Looking sharp, huh?" To which another replies, "Any sharper and you'd be a nigger." Other, more recent Italian Americans have made careers out of crossing the racial and dancing divides. Scott Ielacci, best known as DJ Scribble, and James D'Agostino, who operates as DJ Green Lantern, are two of the most successful hip-hop producers in the early 21st century. And of course, Madonna Louise Ciccone has made more money by singing and dancing to black-influenced music than any other American in history. Despite the transgressions of these renegades, official Italian America remains willfully ignorant of its people's history. In 2002, Chuck Nice, an African-American DJ at the hip-hop radio station WAXQ-FM in New York City, commented on air that Italians are niggas with short memories. The Order of the Sons of Italy in America, which 80 years earlier had insisted to Congress that Italians were inherently white, promptly announced that they were puzzled by the statement and demanded an apology from the station. Of course, given the renegade history of Italian Americans, Chuck Nice's statement is hardly puzzling. But more importantly, let us use that history, as well as the histories of all the primitive and black European immigrants who contributed so much to our freedoms and pleasures, to turn what the sons of Italy viewed as an insult into a compliment.
This is the end of the CD. The audiobook continues on the next CD.